Hey guys, this is Chris from Deus Ex Machina. This started off as a very long video. I decided to break it up and talk about why I write, the process of how I write, and hopefully give advice to people, not necessarily how to write because your writing style is your own, but if you're suffering from some of the similar conditions that I suffer from, ways that you can try to work around that to try to become a functional writer. But this is more or less a window into my writing style, such that it is, as I've often said, I don't think I'm as good a writer as some people think I am, but it shows you the process. So let's go into it. Another way of doing things is something the way George R. R. Martin writes, where it feels very visual. You feel as if you're watching a TV show in a written form, which is not too far off because George R. R. Martin was a screenwriter before he started. Before he wrote Game of Thrones, he already had screenplay credits. He was someone who knew how to write for television and movies. And I love that writing style. I think George R. R. Martin and Game of Thrones, the Song of Ice and Fire series, was incredibly inspirational. Harlan Ellison was incredibly inspirational as well. But for me, when I was writing, I quickly became fascinated with screenwriting, and screenwriting is very different. Screenwriting, you don't spend time, you don't spend too much time explaining a setting. You basically get to the point. You can be as colorful as you want, but you have to be as short as possible to get the idea out of the way. You can be creative. You can explain the room, the set, but ultimately it's what people are saying and their actions. And that's very much how I write, which is not something a lot of people like. They want that narrative voice. They don't really care about what people say as much. They want that narrative voice. And that's something I don't do. And that's where I sometimes feel as if I'm weak in that regard, in that because I want to get to the action. I want to get to what people are saying and doing rather than what they're thinking, what they're feeling. That moment where time freezes and you think about, you dive into the character's mental state. And I have problems focusing on that because if this was a movie, you wouldn't do that. You would shift over to the next moment, and if a character's feeling bad, they'll say they're feeling bad, or they'll act in a way that conveys that they're feeling bad rather than going into a tangent for 2 pages. And a very famous of this was a novel called Anathem by Neil Stephenson. And I had this conversation with Jerry Holkins from Penny Arcade once, and then I had a conversation on the phone many years ago where I told him I really didn't care for Anathem. I tried, and I couldn't get through it. And he agreed. He actually said he didn't care for it either, and I felt vindicated because everyone said I was wrong for disliking Anathem, and I felt that it was in love with its prose, but I couldn't get through the prose to the novel, to the story being told. And that's a real problem, I think. And one example of a novel I love that does it as well is this one right here, Cloud Atlas. I saw the trailer for the movie, got interested in the book, read the book before I saw the movie, found how different they were and how they presented their story. But the one thing Cloud Atlas novel does that doesn't get conveyed in the movie is the prose, which shifts considerably. You have a diary to letters to a traditional story to a historical account to a more first-person narrative. And not only that, but in each of these stories, David Mitchell changes how the prose works. I mean, I mentioned the format, but also because they're in different time periods, the characters will write and speak in a certain way, and there's no better conveyance of that is in the last 2 stories, or the stories that are set furthest back in time, which are the central stories, which are incredibly difficult to go through because of the prose that David employed, including the story set in the distant future, which involves new dialogue and new words, new ways of people talking, and it's a challenge. And I appreciated that because that was the part of the basis of the story. And it's interesting that Cloud Atlas succeeded in that where Anathem failed in regard, because Anathem felt it was more in love with that idea rather than its story, where with Cloud Atlas that was part of the structure of the story and how it was being conveyed. So I really like that. I am incapable of writing in that fashion. I don't believe I have the capacity to do that. I'm very, very much aware of my limitations, and I don't believe I could spend time fabricating a writing style that we see in several of the aspects of the story, or even in Anathem. I would never spend time renaming things because I find that arbitrary. If you're communicating in English, use English words. And if you're doing something that wouldn't exist in our reality, then call it something else. In Affinity, we're dealing with 3 completely different parallel realities set in fabricated universes. And so I would be in the right to go ahead and change the names of things. But I always consider that arbitrary, because you're still reading an English novel written by somebody who's speaking in English and using English words. And so if there is a train, I'm calling it a train. I'm not calling it a roly-poly. And the reason why I'm not calling it a roly-poly is because if I call it a train, you know what I'm talking about, and I don't have to worry about having to explain that or have you be confused about what a roly-poly is. Because if I'm going to say words like book and watch and clock, then train comes from only a couple, a century, 2 or before or after, or sometimes from the same time period. When we take dialogue, when we create vocabulary, we're putting a pin at an arbitrary point in history and saying, after this point, we're creating new words. And so if you see something like a dirigible, right, and you can call it a blimp, and some people will call it a zeppelin, although that would not be accurate because zeppelin's a person. But if you have an airship, you could call it an airship. You wouldn't call it a bouncing ball or something. It doesn't make any sense. Or you can create some kind of random, in the case of Anathem, a spielicaptor, and you look at it and go, you know what? You're saying words that are from that same time period, so it's rather arbitrary that you would have to rename what a camera is. And it's stuff like that, where I generally won't. So if there's a creature, I'm going to call it what it is. If it's a cat, it's going to be a cat. But in the case of this story, there are no animals from Earth in this setting. So everything has kind of changed its names because they are different creatures. So there are cat-like creatures. I don't call them cats. I call them something that's similar. So when you hear the felidae or feline kind of name, it sounds like you're like, oh, it's a cat. In the same case as somebody will call somebody a primate, because they may not know what a chimpanzee is, but we know what a primate is, because we can have a creature that's a primate, but it's not a chimpanzee, so I call it something else, but it's a primate, so I say it's a primate. You kind of know where I'm coming from. And so if you're creating something new, like if it's a new animal, then that's something different. If you have an anti-gravity vehicle, you're not going to call it a helicopter or a plane because it doesn't use rotors, doesn't have wings. So you can call it something else. In the case of Affinity, it's called a ziggurat or a conestoga, and these things have these names. And so when you say this flying airship called a conestoga, you know that even though a conestoga is a carriage from the 18th century, that in this reference, conestoga is a flying airship of some kind. And stuff like that is relatively easy to convey, but I wouldn't just change a name. If it's a camera, it's a camera. If it's a car, it's a car. If it's a train, it's a train. And some people love that challenge. And I know there's some authors out there that really love and enjoy the idea of playing with dialogue and playing with prose. And I don't say that's wrong, and I don't say it's bad. I say it's a literary decision. I will say I dislike the ideology from readers that say that is the way you should be writing. Because I have encountered people that say they don't want to pick up a novel unless it challenges them narratively. This has been Chris from Deus Ex Machina, and I'll see you guys next time. Like and subscribe. Peace.